I trusted him with my daughter and with my legacy. The night I found him in my bedroom, wearing my watch, he didn't even flinch. Some betrayals don't need words, just the sound of a ticking second hand that no longer belongs to you. I trusted him with my daughter and with my legacy. The night I found him in my bedroom, wearing my watch, he didn't even flinch. Some betrayals don't need words, just the sound of a ticking second hand that no longer belongs to you. The rain that night was soft, the kind that doesn't fall, but lingers like a memory that refuses to end. I had just come back from a 3-day trip. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't rest. There was something different in the air, a stillness too complete, a silence too heavy. Sunset Manor had always been my refuge, yet that night it felt like a stranger's house, wearing my walls. John Miller, 55, sat on the edge of his bed, rubbing his temples. The faint glow of the hallway slipped through the half-open door. The house was supposed to be empty. His daughter and her husband had gone to visit friends. At least, that's what they said. But then, a sound. A slow creak. The kind of sound that doesn't belong in peace. He froze. At first, he thought it was the wind brushing the shutters. Then another sound. A faint rustle fabric against wood. A whisper of movement from his bedroom across the hall. His chest tightened. Instinct told him something is off, but reason whispered, "You're imagining, thing." He stepped out into the corridor. Barefoot, quiet. The floor was cool against his feet. The old clock in the living room ticked slow and steady. The same clock that had been there since Maria was alive. She used to say that silence tells you who's home before sound ever does. That thought made him smile for a second, and then the smile faded. The door to his bedroom was ajar, just enough to see the faint shimmer of gold in the dark. The kind of light that dances on metal. For a second, he thought he was dreaming. But as he pushed the door open, reality hit harder than any nightmare could. Standing there, half lit by the soft glow from the hallway, was his son-in-law Daniel. And on his wrist, John's watch. The same one Maria gave him on their 25th anniversary. The one she'd saved 6 months' salary for. The one he wore the day she was buried. Daniel didn't even look surprised. He turned slowly, smirking, that quiet, confident smirk of someone who already believes he owns the room. "Oh," he said softly, like he'd been caught in nothing more than a borrowed moment. "You're back early." John's throat tightened, but he didn't raise his voice. His eyes fell on the watch again, that thin old band glinting under the soft light. "That watch," he said quietly. "You know what it means?" Daniel shrugged. "It's just a watch, Dad." He said the word "dad" like it was a performance, a role he'd rehearsed to perfection. John took a slow step forward. "It's never just a watch," he murmured. His voice barely rose above a whisper. But it carried weight, the kind of weight that comes from years of trust, love, and loss. For a few seconds, neither man moved. The only sound was the rain tapping on the window and the relentless ticking of that clock in the hallway, the same rhythm echoing from the stolen watch. Time, John thought, is the only witness that never lies. He looked at Daniel, at the expensive suit, the carefully trimmed beard, the easy arrogance, and saw not a son, but a stranger dressed in borrowed respect. "How long have you been in here?" John asked. Daniel leaned back against the dresser, crossing his arms. "I was just checking something. Didn't think you'd mind?" John's hand tightened on the door frame. "You didn't think I'd mind you walking into my room wearing that?" Daniel smiled, and it was the kind of smile that burned colder than anger. "You're getting old, John. Maybe it's time someone else started keeping time for you." The words hung in the air. Deliberate, cruel, rehearsed. John didn't respond. He didn't yell, didn't demand, didn't strike. He just stood there, breathing slowly, letting the silence stretch between them like a blade. Then quietly he said, "Take it off." Daniel looked at him for a long second, and then, without breaking eye contact, he turned and walked past him, still wearing the watch. The rain outside grew heavier. John stayed where he was, staring at the open door, the empty hallway, and the faint reflection of himself in the mirror. Older, smaller, but steadier than ever. He didn't know it yet, but that night was not about the watch. It was about everything that had already been stolen piece by piece, while he was too busy believing in family. He sat down, resting his hands on his knees, listening to the ticking that came from nowhere and everywhere. Every second a reminder, every second a countdown. And somewhere in that sound, the man who once believed trust was a virtue began to learn that sometimes silence is just betrayal, wearing patience's face. People think betrayal happens in a moment, a single act, a sudden break, but it doesn't. It's a quiet construction. A smile here, a favor there, a promise that feels harmless, until one day you realize you've handed your house keys to a stranger. The first time I met Daniel, he was standing on my porch with a bouquet of lilies and a nervous smile. My daughter, Emily, was beside him, her hand tucked around his arm, like he was her anchor. "Dad," she said, glowing, "this is Daniel." He reached out, his hand firm, respectful. "Mr. Miller, it's an honor, sir." That word "sir" carried weight back then. It meant respect, but looking back, I realized some people say "sir" the way wolves lower their heads before biting. I invited him in, poured coffee, and we talked about everything men talk about when pretending to measure each other. He was polite, articulate, and well-dressed, a finance consultant with dreams of building his own firm. I liked that. I respected ambition. By the end of that first evening, I caught myself thinking, maybe this man will take care of her. The night they announced their engagement, Emily hugged me so tightly that I almost believed I wasn't losing her, just expanding the family. At the reception, Daniel raised his glass and said, "To Mr. Miller, the man, I hope to become." Everyone clapped. I smiled. But deep inside, a voice whispered, "Be careful with praise. That sounds too perfect." Still, I ignored it. Because fathers do that. We see what we want to see, and we mistake charm for character. After the wedding, Daniel started spending more time at the house. He helped me with paperwork maintenance, small errands. I appreciated it. He called me Dad so naturally that even I started forgetting he wasn't my blood. I gave him a spare key, not out of trust, but habit. Family doesn't ask for permission. One afternoon, I caught him standing in my study, staring at my late wife's photo. "She was beautiful," he said softly. "Emily has her eyes." There was warmth in his tone, maybe too much of it, but I dismissed it. People grieve differently, I thought. Maybe he was just being kind. But kindness, when rehearsed, has an echo. And every time he said Dad, I began to notice that echo. At dinners, he'd take charge of the conversation. Talk about markets, real estate expansion. Emily adored his confidence. I watched her slowly become a reflection of his rhythm, always agreeing, always defending, even when he spoke over her. I started sensing a quiet imbalance in my own home. The kind of shift you can't see, only feel like a table leg, just slightly off level. Then came the small disappearances. A few cigars from my drawer, a leather-bound notebook, a cufflink. Nothing valuable enough to accuse someone over, but enough to notice. One night, while I was cleaning out my desk, I realized my wife's letter, the one she wrote before passing, wasn't where it used to be. I looked everywhere. It wasn't about the paper. It was about the words inside. It was her last message. "John, guard your time and give it only to those who honor it." And yet I ignored the warning, even in absence. The next morning, Daniel arrived early for coffee. He had that easy smile again. "Morning, Dad," he said, sliding into the chair across from me. I was thinking, you've built something great here. Maybe it's time to let someone younger help carry it forward. The way he said it wasn't cruel. It was casual, confident, calculated. I looked at him, really looked at him. Behind the charm, behind the polite tone, there was something else. Hunger dressed as helpfulness. Tell me, I asked, what makes a man worthy of carrying something forward? He grinned. Vision, drive, and knowing when to take what's offered before someone else does. He said it like it was wisdom. But all I heard was theft, waiting for permission. I nodded slowly, hiding the unease twisting in my gut. "You're right, Daniel," I said. "But remember, what's taken without honor never lasts." He laughed softly. "You sound like my father." That was the first time I realized he never talked about his father. Not once. Maybe because men like him only learn from examples they can manipulate. Later that evening, Emily called. She said Daniel wanted to help me restructure the family accounts to make things easier for you, Dad. I told her I'd think about it. But that night when I went to bed, I placed my watch on the nightstand, the gold one Maria had given me. I remember glancing at it before turning off the light, the second hand ticking steady. And I remember thinking maybe he really is just trying to help. It would take months for me to realize the moment I handed him that trust, I wasn't giving him help. I was giving him time. And time, once given to the wrong hands, never ticks the same again. There are objects that outlive the people who gave them meaning. For me, that object was a watch. Gold. Simple, quiet, yet louder than any heartbeat I've ever known. Maria gave it to me on our 25th wedding anniversary. We didn't have much that year. The company was struggling. The house was half mortgaged, and I was losing more hair than sleep. But she saved quietly, the way she always did. When I unwrapped it, I remember laughing. "You shouldn't have," I said. And she answered, "I didn't buy a watch, John. I bought you time." Those words stayed with me long after she was gone. The day she passed, I wore that watch to her funeral. I remember standing beside her casket, listening to the priest's voice fade into the background and hearing only one sound: tick, tick, tick. It felt like her heartbeat, refusing to stop. I promised I'd never take it off again. But life has a way of making promises feel optional when loneliness moves in. After she died, Emily grew up faster than I wanted. I poured myself into work, into schedules, into silence. The watch became my only constant. When things went wrong, I'd glance at it, not to check the time, but to remind myself I was still alive. Every scratch on its glass told a story. A long meeting, a broken deal, a night I forgot to sleep. But it also held moments of grace. The day Emily graduated. The day she said, "Dad, I met someone." I took the watch off for her wedding. I remember polishing it that morning, staring at my reflection on the gold surface. Maria would have loved this, I thought. She always dreamed of seeing Emily in a white dress. When I walked my daughter down the aisle, Daniel stood waiting at the altar, nervous, sweating, too proud to admit it. I shook his hand, and for a second, I believed maybe Maria had sent him to give Emily the kind of stability I couldn't anymore. I was wrong, because the same watch that had once marked every honest second of my life was now being worn by a man who valued nothing but appearances. I realized that night, watching him under the soft glow of the reception lights, the way he moved, the way he calculated every gesture, it was charm sharpened into a blade. When he danced with Emily, his eyes flicked toward me just for a second. And in that second, I saw something cold. Ownership. Still, I ignored it. I convinced myself it was paranoia, an old man's fear of being replaced. But time has a cruel way of making truth wait until you can't unsee it. Years later, when I found him in my bedroom, the watch on his wrist, the same watch I hadn't worn since Maria's death, I felt something inside me collapse quietly. Not anger, not shock, just the weight of every moment I had trusted the wrong man. I didn't see Daniel standing there that night. I saw time stolen and paraded like a trophy. I saw every second Maria gave me twisted into vanity. People think betrayal hurts because of what is lost. But no betrayal hurts because it forces you to question what was ever real. After that night, I couldn't touch the watch for days. I left it on the dresser, like an artifact from a past life. Every time I walked by, I could hear it ticking, but the sound wasn't steady anymore. It was irregular, uneven, a reminder that even time breaks when handled by the wrong hands. I sat on the porch one morning, coffee in hand, watching the sunrise bleed into gold, the same hue as the watch. I realized something. Then Maria's gift wasn't meant to be owned. It was meant to be understood. She hadn't bought me time. She had bought me awareness. And that awareness was whispering now, "You've been too generous with people who never learned how to earn it." I finished my coffee and went back inside. Daniel's laughter echoed from the kitchen. Emily was there too, setting the table, her eyes lighting up when she saw me. "Morning, Dad," she said. "Daniel made pancakes." I smiled faintly. The watch was on his wrist again, gold gleaming under the morning light. He noticed me looking, and this time he didn't even hide his grin. "Want to try one?" he asked. "I used your recipe." I stared at him for a moment, the edges of his arrogance perfectly polished. Then I nodded. Maybe later. He didn't know it yet, but that smile, that unbothered, careless grin, was the last one he'd wear in my house. Because from that moment, every tick of that stolen watch stopped counting seconds. It started counting down. The night after breakfast, I couldn't sleep. Not because of anger, but because of that smile. It wasn't the kind of smile you give someone you respect. It was the kind you give someone you've already measured and decided they're too tired to fight back. I sat in the dark living room, the soft hum of the old refrigerator filling the silence. My reflection stared back from the window, older, quieter, but not defeated. Outside, rain returned falling with that same rhythm I had learned to live by. Every betrayal, I thought, begins in the dark. The house was still. Emily had gone to bed. Daniel was supposed to be in the guest room, but the faint light under the door told me he wasn't sleeping either. I could hear soft footsteps, steady, confident, like he belonged everywhere he walked. I waited until I heard the creak of my bedroom door again. Then I rose, slow and deliberate, the wood under my feet groaning, like it remembered every burden I'd ever carried. The hallway was dim, lit only by a nightlight Maria once placed there to keep Emily from fearing the dark. Funny now, I was the one walking into the fear. When I reached the door, I didn't rush. I stood there for a moment, my hand resting on the frame, listening. There it was again, the faint sound of metal, shifting drawers, opening, the small, confident breaths of a man too comfortable in another man's room. I pushed the door open. He didn't turn. Daniel stood by the dresser, back half turned toward me, the watch glinting under the soft glow of the hallway light. His reflection in the mirror was calm, almost rehearsed, a man admiring himself in someone else's life. He saw me through the mirror before he saw me in person. Our eyes met in that thin sheet of glass that separated truth from pretense. For a moment, neither of us spoke. He didn't flinch. He just adjusted the strap like he was in his own house. I walked in, closing the door behind me. The sound was soft, but final. "Can't sleep?" I asked quietly. He turned, his posture relaxed, confident. "Just looking around," he said. "You have some fine taste, Dad. This watch, it's vintage, right?" I studied him. "You could say that." He smirked. Thought I'd try it on. It suits me, don't you think? The light hit his face just enough to show the arrogance hiding behind that calm tone. He was testing me not for permission, but for reaction. It's not about how it suits you, I said, stepping closer. It's about what it gets to wear it. He shrugged. You mean money? Don't worry. I can afford something better. I stopped 2 steps away. I wasn't talking about money. The room went still again. The rain softened, as if the world itself wanted to listen. The ticking from the hallway clock began to sync with the ticking of the watch on his wrist, 2 rhythms fighting for dominance. I could feel Maria's voice somewhere inside me, quiet but steady. Don't raise your voice, John. Just let him reveal himself. Daniel slipped his hands into his pockets, leaning against the dresser. You know, I've always admired how calm you are. Most men would have lost their temper by now. I smiled faintly. That's the thing about age. You learn that anger gives thieves what they want, your peace. He tilted his head, a hint of a grin forming. And what if peace isn't worth much anymore? That was when I understood he wasn't here for a thing. He was here for a statement. He wanted to claim something intangible control. You're standing, I said slowly, in a room you didn't build, touching what you didn't earn, wearing what you don't understand. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. You really think everything has to mean something, don't you? It does, I said. Especially the things we pretend don't. He turned his gaze back to the mirror, straightening the cuff of his sleeve. The watch glimmered faintly, its second hand moving in smooth, steady circles. Then, without looking at me, he said, Maybe I'm just ahead of my time. That line, arrogant, precise, calculated, hung in the air, like the final sentence of a confession he didn't care to hide. I took one slow step forward. My reflection aligned with his in the mirror. 2 men, one past his prime, one too confident to see the fall coming. I whispered, You're not ahead of time, Daniel. You're running out of it. He turned smirk, still there, eyes gleaming. You'll have to prove that. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The silence said enough. I turned toward the door, paused, and added, Enjoy the watch. It remembers every hand that's ever lied to it. Then I walked out slow, steady, leaving him alone in the dim room. Behind me, I heard the faint click of the door closing. The sound echoed through the house, blending with the rain. And for the first time in years, I didn't hear the ticking of the watch anymore. Because some silences aren't empty. They're loaded, waiting. There's a moment in every father's life when his daughter's voice stops sounding like a child's and starts sounding like someone else's. For me, that moment came slowly. Word by word, excuse by excuse. After that night, I caught Daniel in my room. I didn't tell Emily. I couldn't. She had his eyes now, the kind that don't question, only defend. When she spoke about him, there was a light in her voice, but not the kind born from love. It was the flicker of belief, the blind kind that burns until it leaves only smoke. Dad, she used to say, he's just under pressure. You know how business is. He's trying. I'd nod. Not because I believed it, but because I didn't want to see the day she stopped saying we and started saying he. One Sunday morning, I was fixing a loose hinge on the porch When she came outside, phone in hand, tears already in her eyes. "He's upset," she said. "You confronted him, didn't you?" I froze, screwdriver still in my hand. She didn't even wait for my answer. "He told me you've been watching him, that you don't trust him." "Dad, why would you do that?" Her words weren't hers. They were rehearsed echoes of someone else's script. "I didn't confront him," I said quietly. I asked him a question. "What question?" She demanded. What my wife's watch was doing on his wrist. Her breath caught. The way guilt freezes before it hides. Maybe he borrowed it. Maybe I interrupted softly. He didn't need to. The wind moved through the trees, stirring the chimes. Maria had hung years ago. The sound was delicate, almost merciful. I wished Emily could hear the truth in it, that peace doesn't need defending. Lies do. She turned away, arms folded. "You always think the worst of people, Dad. Daniel's been trying so hard to make you proud." Proud. That word hit harder than it should have. I thought of the nights Maria and I stayed up, worrying about Emily's future, the school bills, the college forms, the long talks about kindness and strength. I thought of how I told her that trust was the foundation of love. And now here she was, building her home on that same word, only this time it was hollow. That night after she left, I sat by the fireplace and listened to the house breathe. Every corner of it carried her laughter. Every wall held the memory of a smaller voice that once called out, "Daddy, I made this for you." Now the same voice called to defend the man who had stolen from her family, and she didn't even know it. I found myself whispering into the flames, as if Maria could still hear me. "You'd know what to say, wouldn't you? You'd know how to reach her." The fire crackled, and in its rhythm, I thought I heard her voice again, faint but familiar. "Don't protect her from pain, John. Teach her to see through it." See? The next day I started listening differently. Not to what Daniel said, but to what Emily stopped saying. She no longer talked about her own dreams. She talked about his. She no longer shared her worries. She defended his. And when I asked her about her happiness, she smiled the kind of smile people wear when they're trying to believe it themselves. That's when I knew Daniel hadn't just taken my trust. He was taking her voice. I began keeping a journal. Again, small notes, quiet, observations. I didn't write to remember. I wrote to prepare. To remind myself that silence, when chosen, is not weakness, it's strategy. Days turned into weeks. Daniel began controlling everything, her calls, her visits, even how long she stayed with me. When she did come, she carried his opinions like a script she had to perform perfectly. One afternoon I watched her standing in the kitchen, stirring tea. Her hand trembled slightly, though she smiled as if nothing was wrong. I noticed a faint bruise on her wrist, hidden beneath her sleeve. She saw me looking and quickly pulled it down. "It's nothing, Dad." I tripped. I didn't ask. I just nodded. Because sometimes, when your child lives in denial, questions only build taller walls. That night, as I lay awake, I could still hear her voice. "Dad, please don't be hard on him. He's under a lot of stress." I whispered back into the dark, "Stress? doesn't make a man cruel. Emily, character does. The next morning I found Daniel in my study, again pretending to look for a book. He smiled the same easy grin. Morning, Dad. Rough night. I looked at him calmly. No, just thinking. About what? About how long people can hide behind charm before it starts to crack. He laughed softly. That's deep. You should write that down. I already did, I said. He didn't know it yet, but that line would appear in the same ledger that would one day expose every lie he'd built his life on. Because from that day forward, I stopped confronting him as a father. I started observing him as a man. It started with a drawer. The one Maria used to keep our tax papers in, neatly labeled in her handwriting. Graceful, round letters that made even bills look gentle. One morning, I opened it, and something felt off. Not missing, rearranged. The folders were there, but lighter. Some pages were gone. Others had been replaced with copies, not the originals. That's when I knew Daniel hadn't just crossed boundaries. He had started building inside them. I sat at the desk and stared at the empty space where my trust used to be. I could still smell his cologne faintly on the chair, like arrogance lingering after a meeting. For a long moment, I did nothing. I just listened to the rain, the ticking, the silence. Then I took out a notebook and wrote 3 words. Ledger, signature, truth. I decided I wouldn't confront him again. Not with anger, not with words. I'd let evidence speak the language he respected power. That night, when the house fell asleep, I checked the security cameras I had installed years ago, back when we had a small break-in scare. I hadn't used them since Maria's passing, but they were still there, quietly recording. The footage showed Daniel entering my office late at night. Calm, intentional. He looked through drawers, took photos with his phone, and even smiled once, like he was proud of his own precision. He was copying financial ledgers, family accounts, business records, signatures. The kind of paperwork that could quietly transfer everything from my name to his without anyone noticing until it was too late. I paused the video. The frame showed his reflection in the window, confident, untouchable, sure of the illusion he built. I whispered to myself, "You're not stealing money, Daniel. You're stealing identity." I printed stills from the footage and locked them in a safe he didn't know existed a small iron box behind Maria's portrait. She'd always said, "Hide nothing you're ashamed of, only what the world will misuse." The next morning, I played my role. I greeted him as usual, shared breakfast, nodded through his small talk. He spoke about investment plans, how we should move some assets to newer opportunities. We felt like a trespass, but I just smiled. "Send me the proposal," I said. He looked pleased, too pleased. "You'll see, Dad. You'll thank me one day." I almost pitied him. Almost. Later, I went through my files, and I found what he'd forged, a copy of my signature on a new power of attorney document. It was perfect. Even I had to look twice. But there was one flaw. Maria's initials in the witness line, the same way she used to sign cards, MLM. He must have found old paperwork and copied it, not realizing those initials meant nothing legal anymore. It was poetic, really, the dead protecting the living one last time. That night, I called my lawyer, an old friend named Carter. I told him to quietly freeze all transfers, review every signature, and send me duplicates of every document in our company's registry. "Are you in trouble, John?" he asked. "No," I said softly, "just tidying up before the storm." After that, I didn't confront Daniel. I watched him. I observed how he moved through my house, like he'd already inherited it. He started giving small orders to the staff, answering my phone calls, managing mail, like a prince rehearsing for a throne that wasn't vacant yet. Sometimes I caught him standing in my study looking at Maria's portrait. He'd tilt his head slightly, as if studying her expression, maybe wondering what she'd seen in me that he could never imitate. I wrote in my journal again that night, "Men like him don't just take what's yours. They take what you forget to protect." A week later, Carter called. "John, your signature appeared on a transfer request for the Sunrise account, $500,000. I stopped it. "Want to see the document?" "Yes," I said. When I opened the email, I felt no surprise, only confirmation. There it was, my name written perfectly. My handwriting, my style forged with precision. But at the bottom, one mistake, the date. The day he filed it was Maria's birthday. He couldn't have known. He'd just written a confession in plain ink. I leaned back, the faintest smile touching my lips. The watch on his wrist ticked, in my mind steady and proud, but now I owned the rhythm again. That night I left a small note in his room. Just one line, folded neatly on the dresser. "A man who steals time steals legacy." I didn't sign it. I didn't have to. When I passed by his door that morning, it was wide open, the paper gone. He looked at me from the breakfast table, pale, unreadable. "Rough night?" I asked. He smiled thinly. "You could say that." And as I poured my coffee, I realized something quietly satisfying. The same silence he once used to hide his deceit was now hiding my preparation. He didn't know it yet, but every tick of that golden watch was no longer measuring his success. It was measuring his countdown. I've learned something about men who lie. They can handle confrontation, but not calmness. Because calmness means you're not surprised anymore. And nothing frightens a liar more than realizing his game no longer shocks you. The morning after he found my note, Daniel avoided my eyes. Not completely, just enough to notice. At breakfast, he stirred his coffee longer than usual. The spoon clinked against the porcelain like a nervous tell. Emily talked about nothing in particular. The weather, a friend's baby, the new curtains. But Daniel's silence was the loudest thing at that table. I watched him, not directly, but the way one studies a painting from the corner of their eye. You see more when you pretend not to. He still wore the watch. Of course he did. But now he glanced at it more often, like a guilty man checking how long he had left before his lie caught up. After breakfast, he announced he had a meeting downtown. He kissed Emily on the cheek, grabbed his jacket, and left. His steps were quicker than usual, like the ground beneath him had turned fragile. The moment the car engine faded, I called Carter. "Let it breathe," I told him. "Don't freeze anything else yet." "You're sure?" Yes, I want him to think the silence is safety. When I hung up, I stood by the window, watching the rain slide down the glass. The world looked blurred, washed of definition, like a reflection unsure of itself. It reminded me of Daniel. He came home later that evening, smelling faintly of whiskey and nerves. His tie was crooked, his confidence dimmed. "Long day?" I asked, sitting in the armchair by the fire. He hesitated, then smiled thinly. "You could say that." I nodded. Work can do that to a man, especially when he's building something out of other people's materials. His smile faltered. "What's that supposed to mean?" I looked up at him, eyes calm. "It means I hope whatever you're building is strong enough to stand when the wind changes." He stared at me, searching for an opening. A crack, an accusation, a threat. He found none. I returned to my book. The silence between us became a mirror, and in it he started seeing himself too clearly. That night, I heard him pacing the hallway. He thought I was asleep. Every few minutes, his footsteps stopped outside my door, not entering, not leaving, just waiting, like a man standing between guilt and exposure. The next morning, Emily left for her volunteer work. The house grew still again. Daniel lingered near the back porch, pretending to read emails. I joined him quietly, coffee in hand. "Beautiful morning," I said. He looked up, startled. "Yeah, sure is." I studied his face in the soft light. The sharp edges were fading, eyes heavier, jaw tighter, smile forced. The kind of look a man wears when he's playing poker with the truth. "You've got that watch on again," I said. He glanced down, his thumb brushing the strap. "I like how it feels." I nodded. Funny. I always thought it felt heavier than it looks. He frowned. "Why's that?" "Because it carries time that isn't yours." He didn't answer. Instead, he walked back inside. Later that day, I saw him in my office again, standing by the window, pretending to admire the view. But his eyes weren't on the horizon. They were on the portrait of Maria. He whispered something I couldn't hear. Then he touched the frame. I stepped in. "Careful," I said. "That frame's older than you think." He froze, hand mid-air. I know I interrupted softly. "You never are." He turned toward me, frustration flickering. "You don't trust me, do you?" I took a slow breath. I did. For a while. That was my mistake. His jaw tightened. "You think you've got me all figured out, old man? You think sitting there with your little notes makes you some kind of judge?" "No," I said evenly. "Just someone who's run out of surprises." For the first time, the mask cracked. The smile vanished. And in its place, I saw the truth, small, raw, trembling. He wanted control. He wanted admiration. But more than anything, he wanted to be feared. And fear is something I buried with Maria. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." I met his gaze steady. "Neither do you." A long silence followed, the kind that burns. Then he turned and walked out, slamming the door. The sound echoed through the house, shaking the dust from the walls. I looked at Maria's portrait. Her eyes, painted with that same gentle calm, seemed to watch me knowingly. "You were right," I whispered. "The loudest people are always the most afraid." That night, I opened my journal and wrote, "The mask doesn't shatter when truth appears. It cracks when silence stops feeding it. I didn't know it yet, but that silence was about to speak louder than anything I could have said. Because the next morning, Daniel would walk into a meeting he thought he'd orchestrated and find himself staring at the truth he'd built with his own hands. I didn't invite him into my office to destroy him. I invited him to see himself. It was Friday morning, the kind of morning that pretends to be calm. The air was clear, the house was quiet, and the coffee tasted like closure. Daniel came in around 9. He smelled of cologne and calculation. Emily had already left. She always did on Fridays. I waited by the window, the same window where Maria used to water her plants and hum old songs from a life that didn't involve betrayal. "Morning, Dad," he said, his tone polite but thinner now, like a thread stretched too tight. "Morning," I replied. "Got a minute?" "Of course." He sat down across from me, adjusting his cufflinks like a man still pretending to control the rhythm. On the desk between us was my old laptop screen, dark waiting. Next to it, a single black folder. I watched his eyes flick to it, then back to me. "You've been busy lately," I said. He smiled faintly, trying to keep things running. "You know how it is managing legacy." That word again, legacy. He said it like he was already rehearsing for my eulogy. I nodded. Legacy's a funny thing. People think it's built with what they take, but it's really built by what they protect. He tilted his head. "You sound philosophical this morning." "Maybe I am." I turned the laptop screen toward him and pressed play. The room filled with the faint hum of a security feed, grainy, time-stamped, and merciless. The footage showed Daniel in the same room late at night, calm, efficient, opening drawers, photographing documents, wearing my watch. For a moment, he didn't breathe. His jaw clenched just enough for the mask to tremble. He looked at me, eyes darting between the screen and my face. You had cameras?" I didn't answer. The video kept playing the image of him scrolling through files, copying signatures, placing folders back with mechanical precision. When it ended, silence filled the room like smoke after a shot. He exhaled sharply, leaning back. "So what now, John? You gonna call the cops? Your lawyer? Or are we just going to stare at each other until one of us stops breathing?" I leaned forward, slowly resting my hands on the desk. "You think this is about punishment?" He smirked, but the expression didn't fit anymore. "You tell me." I reached for the folder, opened it, and slid a few papers across to him. Printouts of forged signatures, copies of the fake transfers, the still image of him wearing my watch. His eyes scanned them quickly, his confidence fracturing with every page. Then I said, quietly, "You can keep the watch." He froze. "What?" "You heard me. You can keep it. But the time it stands for." I paused, my voice calm, steady. "It's gone." He stared at me, speechless. The silence between us felt sacred, like a truth finally revealed. That watch, I continued, wasn't just a gift. It was a promise. Every tick you've heard since wearing it, that's not time moving forward. That's grace running out. Grace. He swallowed his throat tight. "You think you're better than me?" "No," I said softly. "Just older. And that means I have already lived through the man you're pretending to be." For the first time since I'd met him, Daniel looked small. The arrogance slipped replaced by something raw fear, or maybe recognition. "You've already lost everything," he whispered. I smiled faintly. That's the difference between us. You think loss is the end. I think it's how truth begins. He rose abruptly, knocking his chair back. "You can't prove anything in court." "I don't need a court," I replied. "You've already sentenced yourself." He blinked, confused. "I sent a copy of that footage to Emily," I said, "not to ruin you, to free her." His face drained of color. "You—" "Yes," I interrupted, "because she deserves to know who she married. And you deserve to hear what silence sounds like when it finally speaks." For a moment, he stood there, breathing hard, shaking slightly. Then, like a man who'd run out of words, he turned and left. The door clicked shut behind him. I sat back in my chair, exhaling for what felt like the first time in years. The watch on his wrist would keep ticking, but every sound it made now would remind him of the truth he couldn't unhear. Outside, the wind shifted. The rain had stopped. I walked to the window, and for the first time, the reflection looking back didn't seem tired. It looked settled. Maria's portrait caught the morning light. I could almost hear her whisper, "You didn't need to win, John. You just needed to stop losing yourself." I nodded slightly. "It's done." But it wasn't revenge that filled me. It was release. Because sometimes justice isn't the noise of a verdict. It's the quiet of a man walking away with nothing left to steal. The silence after truth is unlike any other. It doesn't echo. It settles. Daniel didn't come home that night. Emily did. Her car light swept across the driveway like a lighthouse, searching for something already sunk. I waited on the porch, coffee gone cold jacket draped over my shoulders. When she stepped out, I saw her face pale, swollen from crying. In her hand, she still held her phone. She didn't need to say what she'd seen. The truth had already spoken for me. "Dad," she whispered. "Is it true?" I nodded. There was no victory in it, no satisfaction, just gravity. She sank onto the steps beside me, her breath shaking. For a long while, we said nothing. The wind moved through the trees, and somewhere far off, a dog barked at the kind of night that doesn't end quickly. "I thought he loved me," she said finally. "He probably did," I answered. "Just not the way love should mean." She turned to me, eyes red. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I stared at the yard, the same soil where I'd buried Maria's roses. Because some truths don't survive if you force them. They need to reveal themselves. To reveal. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears. "He said you were paranoid, that you were jealous of him." I smiled faintly. That's how men like him survive. By making their mirrors dirty so no one sees their cracks. Emily's shoulders trembled. "He emptied our joint account. The lawyer called me." "I know," I said softly. "He left just enough behind for you to start over." She blinked, startled. "How?" "I made sure of it. Weeks ago." There was a pause, long, fragile, but clean. Then she whispered, "You knew it would end like this." "I hoped it wouldn't," I said. "But I prepared for when it did." The porch light flickered in the wind. Somewhere inside the house, the clock ticked its quiet, steady rhythm, no longer menacing, just honest. Emily leaned against me like she hadn't done since she was a child, What do I do now? Leave the pieces where they are, I said. Time will decide what to keep. She cried again, this time softly, not in despair, but in release. And for the first time in years, I didn't try to stop her. Because not all breaking is destruction. Some of it is becoming. By morning, Daniel's car was gone. His closet half empty. His drawer stripped of everything but the folded note I'd left weeks before. A man who steals time steals legacy. He hadn't taken it this time. Maybe he finally understood. The house felt lighter without him, not happier, just balanced. Emily spent the next few days in silence. She moved through rooms carefully, like walking through the memory of a life that no longer fit. Every now and then, I caught her standing in front of Maria's portrait, eyes distant, mouth trembling. She'd hate me for this, she said once. No, I replied. She'd forgive you for it. The same way she forgave me for being blind when I shouldn't have been. On the 5th day, she packed her suitcase. I need to get away for a while, she said. I helped her close the latch. Then go where the noise can't find you. She hugged me tight. You don't hate him. I smiled sadly. I don't waste hate on men who've already punished themselves. When her car disappeared down the long gravel road, I stood on the porch and listened not to the ticking clock this time, but to the quiet hum of peace returning. Inside, I opened my drawer and took out the folder. One by one, I fed the folder into the fireplace. The flames took them quickly, hungrily. The ink curled and vanished, leaving nothing but embers, small glowing dots that looked like seconds dissolving. Maria's picture watched from above the mantel. I looked up at her and said softly, You were right again. Truth doesn't need noise. It just needs time. The last paper turned to ash. The room grew still. Outside dawn began to break a pale, forgiving light. I sat in my chair, closed my eyes, and breathed deeply. The house finally felt empty in the right way. And somewhere far away, I imagined Daniel hearing that same ticking. Not as victory, not as memory, but as the one sound he could never outrun. Because silence, when it belonged to the righteous, is the loudest justice there is. Morning came quiet, the kind of quiet that feels earned. The house was empty now. No voices, no arguments, no footsteps that didn't belong. Just light drifting through the curtains and the slow rhythm of a clock that had outlived everything but truth. I sat by the window with a cup of coffee that had gone cold again. The same chair, the same silence, but different air. The kind that doesn't hurt anymore. On the table sat the watch. The gold was dull, scratched, but still ticking. I'd found it in the living room that morning. Daniel must have left it behind. Maybe he couldn't bear the sound anymore. Maybe it reminded him that time only feels endless when you're wasting it. I turned it over in my hand, tracing the small engraving on the back to John. For every second that counts. Maria's handwriting, delicate and sure. She never imagined this watch would become the last witness of everything we built and everything that was taken. I closed my eyes and listened. Tick, tick, tick. It wasn't just sound. It was confession. Every second reminded me that the world doesn't stop when people betray you. It just gets quieter until you learn to move within the quiet. I walked outside. The morning air smelled of rain and ash. The roses had started to bloom again, stubborn things like Maria. I sat on the porch steps, sunlight brushing against my face. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the need to fix anything. Not my daughter, not my legacy, not even my heart. Because I finally understood what Maria meant the day she gave me that watch. She wasn't giving me time. She was teaching me not to waste it on those who don't value it. The clock inside struck 9. Its echo blended with the distant hum of the town waking up. Somewhere, life went on, imperfect, unkind, but honest. I slipped the watch into my pocket. Not to wear it, but to keep the sound close. A reminder that even after everything, time still chooses mercy over anger. I looked toward the horizon and whispered, "Thank you, Maria. You were right. Time doesn't heal all wounds. It just teaches us which ones are worth keeping, are worth." The wind stirred gently, carrying her chimes into motion again. Their song mixed with the ticking, and for a moment the world felt whole, because truth had spoken, and time had kept its word.